I was sitting in a quiet, high-end coffee shop in downtown Boston, staring blindly at an age-progressed photo of my missing son when the man sitting across from me shattered my reality. He looked at the picture, then looked me dead in the eye and said, "You are still looking for him." Before I could even ask who he was, he set a thick manila folder down on the table. He leaned in and whispered everything about the kidnapping 30 years ago is right in here. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. I asked him how he could possibly know anything about it. He did not blink. He simply said, "Because I am the kid in that photo." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to the very people you thought you could trust the most. Your support means everything to me. My name is Richard Caldwell. I am 70 years old, and I have spent my entire adult life building a logistics and real estate empire from absolutely nothing. I am a man who is used to having power. I control shipping routes across the eastern seaboard. I manage thousands of employees. I sit in glass boardrooms and make decisions that move millions of dollars with a single signature. But for all my wealth, for all the influence I have accumulated, I have spent the last 3 decades completely powerless over the one thing that truly mattered to me. My youngest son, Leo. 30 years ago, when Leo was just 4 years old, he vanished without a trace during a family weekend getaway. One moment he was playing, and the next he was gone. The police searched for months. We hired the best private investigators in the country. I spent millions of dollars on media campaigns, offering massive rewards to anyone who could give me a single clue. But the trail was completely cold. My wife Diane was absolutely devastated. She spent years heavily medicated mourning the boy we lost. Our older son Bradley, who is now 38 and the chief financial officer of my company, practically grew up in the shadow of that tragedy. I spent my life trying to provide a perfect existence for Diane and Bradley, trying to compensate for the massive hole in our family. Even my daughter-in-law Valerie enjoys a life of absolute luxury because I wanted my family to never feel pain or worry ever again. But the pain never truly leaves you. Every year on Leo's birthday, the private investigation agency I keep on retainer sends me an updated age-progressed photograph. They use computer software to predict what he would look like today at 34 years old. That is what I was looking at in the coffee shop. The rain was beating against the large glass windows of the cafe. The air smelled of roasted espresso and damp coats. I was completely lost in my own grief, tracing the imaginary lines of my son's face on the glossy paper, wondering where he was, wondering if he was even alive. That was when the chair across from me scraped against the wooden floor. I looked up, annoyed by the intrusion. A man sat down. He was rugged, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark canvas jacket that dripped with rainwater. He had a hard, weathered face, the kind of face that belonged to someone who had lived a very difficult life. He looked to be in his mid-30s. I opened my mouth to tell him that this table was private, but the words died in my throat. He was staring at the photograph in my hands. Then he delivered the words that stopped my breathing. He claimed he was Leo. He claimed he was the boy in the picture. For a moment, all the background noise in the coffee shop completely faded away. The hiss of the espresso machine, the chatter of the other customers, the rain against the glass. It all went completely silent. I stared at his face. I desperately searched his eyes, his jawline, the shape of his nose, looking for a trace of my wife, a trace of myself. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. After 30 years of agonizing dead ends, after decades of waking up in cold sweats, was it possible? Was my boy actually sitting right in front of me? I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of emotion. Tears burned in my eyes. I reached my trembling hand across the small table. I wanted to touch his face. I wanted to pull him into a desperate hug and never let him go. I wanted to tell him that his father never stopped looking for him, that I never gave up hope. But as my hand moved closer to him, he leaned back. He dodged my touch completely. His eyes were entirely cold, calculating, and devoid of any emotion. I am not here for a sweet family reunion, Richard, he said, his voice flat and hard. He did not call me Dad. He called me Richard. The chill in his tone was like a bucket of ice water poured directly over my head. I pulled my hand back, confused and suddenly very cautious. I asked him what he meant. I asked him where he had been all these years, who had taken him, and why he was acting so hostile. He ignored my questions. Instead, he tapped the thick manila folder he had placed on the table. I have the answers, he said. I have the names. I know exactly what happened the day I disappeared, but I am not giving it to you out of the goodness of my heart. I want $2 million in cash, unmarked bills. I sat back in my chair, utterly stunned. My own son, or at least a man claiming to be my son, was sitting across from me, extorting me. My sharp business instincts, honed over decades of ruthless negotiations, immediately kicked in. The desperation faded, replaced by deep suspicion. I told him that I was not a fool. I told him that over the last 30 years, dozens of scammers had come forward claiming to be Leo, hoping to get their hands on my money. I demanded proof. I told him I needed a DNA test before I handed over a single dime. He let out a short, humorless laugh. He did not look intimidated. He looked entirely confident. "You want proof?" he asked quietly. He unzipped his jacket, opened the manila folder, and bypassed the stacks of photographs and typed documents. He pulled out a single piece of paper protected inside a clear plastic sleeve and slid it across the table toward me. "You think a random kidnapper snatched me out of a crowded park?" he asked, his voice dripping with absolute venom. "Look at the document, Richard. Tell me what you see." I put on my reading glasses with shaky fingers. I looked down at the paper. It was a highly confidential banking record. An old physical withdrawal slip from the Caldwell Family Trust. The date stamped at the top of the document caught my eye immediately. It was dated exactly 24 hours before the day Leo vanished. But it was the transaction details that made my blood run entirely cold. It was a massive cash withdrawal, $250,000. Back in the 90s, that was an absolutely staggering amount of cash to pull out of a bank without prior notice. I traced my finger down the page, moving toward the signature line at the bottom. My heart hammered against my ribs so violently, I thought I was going to collapse right there in the coffee shop. I had spent thousands of nights holding my wife while she wept for our missing child. I had paid for her therapy, her retreats, her endless pursuit of peace. Now, staring at the bold, sweeping loops of the cursive handwriting on that paper, I felt a nausea so profound it threatened to empty my stomach. I knew that signature. I had seen it on checks, on anniversary cards, on mortgage documents for over 40 years. It was the signature of Diane Caldwell. My wife. My vision blurred. The air in the coffee shop suddenly felt suffocatingly heavy. I tried to inhale, but my lungs refused to expand. Why would my wife withdraw $250,000 in untraceable cash just one day before our son was taken from us? The question echoed in my mind, ringing with horrifying implications. The stranger stood up, towering over the table. He zipped his jacket up and stared down at me. "You have 48 hours to get my $2 million, Richard," he said quietly. "Or the rest of this folder goes to the press, and your perfect little family gets ripped to shreds." He turned and walked out of the coffee shop, disappearing into the heavy Boston rain. I sat there completely frozen, staring at my wife's signature on the old bank receipt. The grief I had carried for 30 years was suddenly eclipsed by something much darker. The realization that the monster who took my son might not have been a stranger at all. The monster might be sleeping in my own bed. I drove my Mercedes through the slick streets of downtown Boston, the tires hissing against the wet pavement. My hands gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. Every red light felt like a physical blow. The piece of paper sitting on the passenger seat seemed to burn a hole through the very fabric of my reality. $250,000. $250,000 in untraceable cash pulled directly from our family trust. The date stamped on that slip was a ghost rising from the grave. It was the exact day before our boy was taken from us. My mind raced through decades of memories trying to fit this grotesque puzzle piece into the picture of the grieving, fragile wife I had protected all these years. I turned onto the winding, tree-lined streets of Beacon Hill. The rain washed over the grand historic houses, but I could not appreciate any of it. I pulled into the private driveway of my estate. It was a $12 million fortress of stone and wrought iron, a place I had bought to make my family feel safe. I had paid for top-tier security systems, reinforced gates, and private patrols. I wanted to ensure that no one could ever touch my loved ones again. Now looking at the massive front doors, I felt like I was walking into a trap. I turned off the engine and sat in the silence for a heavy moment. I grabbed the manila folder, clutching it to my chest, and stepped out into the freezing rain. I unlocked the front door and pushed it open. The house was warm, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla candles and roasted garlic. From down the long, arched hallway, I could hear the faint sound of classical music playing in the kitchen. I heard the clinking of glassware. I heard laughter. It was a soft, casual laugh. It was Diane. She was talking to someone, her voice light and entirely untroubled. The sound of her joy made my stomach twist into painful knots. For 30 years, I had treated her like glass. I had shielded her from the press, from the police interviews, from the harsh reality of the world, because I thought the kidnapping had broken her spirit. I walked down the hallway, my wet shoes leaving heavy footprints on the polished hardwood floors. I stepped into the massive kitchen. The space was a masterpiece of imported Italian marble and custom lighting, all paid for by my sweat and my late nights at the office. Diane was standing by the massive central island, holding a crystal glass of red wine. She was wearing a silk blouse and her favorite pearl necklace. Standing next to her was our son Bradley. He was leaning casually against the counter, dressed in his tailored suit, holding a glass of scotch. He looked exactly like the confident, wealthy chief financial officer I had molded him to be. They both stopped talking the second I walked in. Diane turned to me, a warm, perfectly crafted smile spreading across her face. "You are home early, dear," she said smoothly. "The weather out there is absolutely dreadful. Bradley just stopped by to drop off the quarterly reports." I did not say a word. I did not greet my son. I did not take off my wet coat. I walked directly to the marble island. The silence in the room became incredibly thick, heavy with the sudden shift in my demeanor. I raised my hand and slammed the bank record down onto the pristine marble countertop. The loud smack echoed through the vast kitchen like a gunshot. Diane jumped. Bradley tensed, his eyes darting to the paper. "Look at it!" I demanded, my voice low, vibrating with a rage I had never allowed myself to show her before. Diane let out a nervous, confused laugh. She stepped closer to the island, peering down at the plastic sleeve. I watched her face. I watched the exact moment her eyes registered the date and the amount. I watched the recognition hit her brain. All the color instantly drained from her skin. She turned ashen, looking as though all the blood had been siphoned from her body. The crystal wine glass slipped from her fingers. It hit the marble floor, shattering into 100 sharp pieces. The dark red wine splattered across the white stone like a pool of fresh blood. Diane stumbled backward, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. She gasped a horrible choking sound, and then she began to hyperventilate. Her chest heaved. Her knees gave out, and she sank against the custom cabinets, her perfectly styled exterior completely crumbling into a display of absolute terror. I did not move to comfort her. I did not reach out to catch her. For the first time in our 45-year marriage, I looked at my wife with pure, unadulterated disgust. "I want an answer, Diane," I said, my voice cutting through her hysterical, gasping sobs. "I want to know why you went to the bank 30 years ago. I want to know why you quietly emptied $250,000 in cash from our trust fund. And I want to know why you did it exactly 24 hours before our son vanished." Diane could not speak. She just shook her head frantically, pulling at her hair, her eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic panic. She opened her mouth, but only choked, breathless sounds came out. She was trying to act like a victim, trying to play the fragile, broken woman I was supposed to rush to protect. I stepped closer, ignoring the broken glass crunching beneath my shoes. "Did you pay someone?" I demanded, the volume of my voice rising. "Did you pay someone to take him? Did you owe someone money? Tell me the truth right now." She wailed a high-pitched, piercing sound that scraped against my eardrums. I was done being patient. I was done playing the gentle husband. I reached down to grab her arm to pull her up and force her to look me in the eye. But before my fingers could even touch her sleeve, a hand clamped down hard on my shoulder. I was shoved backward with surprising force. I stumbled, catching my balance against the edge of the island. I looked up, stunned. It was Bradley. He had stepped directly between me and his mother. His jaw was clenched, his shoulders squared. He stood tall, looking down at me with an expression that made the breath catch in my throat. It was not anger. It was not confusion. It was pity. A cold, calculated, deeply condescending pity. "Dad, stop," Bradley said firmly. His voice was entirely steady, completely lacking the shock a son should feel when viewing a document that implicated his mother in his brother's disappearance. He did not look at the bank record again. He did not ask what it was. He already knew. He placed a protective hand on Diane's trembling shoulder, keeping his cold gaze locked dead on mine. "Just stop, Dad!" He repeated, his tone smooth, almost soothing, as if he were trying to calm down a confused, erratic patient. "You are scaring her. You are taking things entirely out of context." "Out of context," I shouted, gesturing wildly at the paper on the counter. "She pulled out enough cash to buy a house the day before Leo was kidnapped. What context could possibly explain that?" Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh. He looked at me with that same sickening pity, shaking his head slowly, as if burdened by a heavy, unfortunate truth. "She did not want you to know," he said quietly. "She paid the ransom, Dad." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. The kitchen was completely silent, save for Diane's muffled crying on the floor. I stared at my son, trying to process the sheer audacity of his statement. My mind raced, colliding with a brick wall of impossibility. "What are you talking about?" I whispered, the rage faltering for a split second. Bradley stepped forward, his posture authoritative, commanding the space in my house. "The kidnappers contacted her first," he said, his voice entirely unbothered. "They called the house a day before the police were involved. They demanded $250,000. They told her that if she told you with your temper, with your need to control everything, they would kill Leo immediately. So she went to the bank. She got the cash. She made the drop to save him." He looked down at his mother, then back at me. "And they took the money and never gave him back. She has lived with that guilt for 30 years, Dad. She hid it to protect you from the truth." I looked at Diane, still sobbing on the floor. I looked at Bradley, the perfect, composed chief financial officer. It was the perfect excuse. It played on my temper, on her fragility, on the tragedy of the situation. It was a plausible lie designed to shut down my questions instantly. But as I stood there looking into my son's eyes, 40 years of crushing business opponents told me everything I needed to know. The slight relaxation of his shoulders, the almost imperceptible smirk hidden in the corner of his mouth, the way his heart rate had not spiked at all. He was lying. They were both lying to my face. My family was hiding a monster, and the hunt had just begun. I stood frozen in my magnificent kitchen, surrounded by the finest imported materials money could buy, and I had never felt so utterly betrayed in my entire life. The rain continued to batter the large windows of the estate, casting long, dark shadows across the marble floors. I looked down at the bank receipt resting on the counter. The blue ink of the teller stamp was faded, but the implications were sharply in focus. Bradley expected me to fold. He expected me to fall to my knees, to apologize for opening old wounds, to comfort my weeping wife. He thought I was just a tired old man who would swallow a convenient tragedy rather than face an ugly, complicated truth. But I had not built a billion-dollar logistics empire by accepting convenient lies. I had built it by noticing the tiny discrepancies that others ignored. And right now, the biggest discrepancy was standing right in front of me. Why did Bradley, who was only 8 years old at the time of the kidnapping, know the exact details of a secret ransom drop? And why did his eyes look so incredibly cold? I took a slow, deep breath, letting the icy realization wash over me. I forced my expression to soften. I made my shoulders slump, playing the exact role they expected me to play. I nodded slowly, letting out a broken, defeated sigh. I stepped around Bradley and knelt beside Diane, wrapping my arms around her trembling shoulders. I whispered apologies into her ear, telling her I was so sorry for bringing it up. But as I held my sobbing wife, my eyes met Bradley's over her shoulder. The war had silently begun, and I was going to destroy them all. Bradley kept his arm firmly positioned in front of me, acting as a physical barrier between my mounting fury and his weeping mother. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, shaking his head as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world on his tailored shoulders. He walked over to the stainless steel refrigerator, retrieved a crystal tumbler, and filled it with chilled water from the dispenser. His movements were incredibly deliberate, projecting an aura of absolute calm that starkly contrasted with Diane's frantic sobbing on the marble floor. He crouched down beside her, pressing the cold glass into her trembling hands. "Drink this, Mom," he murmured gently, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the massive kitchen. "You need to breathe. Just take a slow breath." Diane choked back a sob, gripping the glass so tightly I thought it might shatter between her palms. She took a tiny, ragged sip, her chest still heaving with panicked breaths. Bradley stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his expensive suit jacket. He turned to face me, his expression hardening into a mask of weary patience. "You want the truth, Dad?" he asked, his voice remarkably steady and low. "You want to know what happened to that money? Fine. I will tell you because she is too terrified to say the words herself." I stood silently, folding my arms across my chest, waiting for the performance to begin. My son looked me directly in the eye, not a single trace of hesitation in his gaze. 30 years ago, Bradley began pacing slowly across the kitchen. The day before the police were ever called, Mom received a phone call at the house. "You were at the office as you always were, closing some massive shipping deal. You were unreachable, stressed, and volatile." The man on the other end of the line told her they had Leo. They told her that if she breathed a single word of this to the authorities or to you, they would hurt him. They demanded $250,000 in untraceable cash. They gave her exactly 12 hours to get the money together. I listened to his words, keeping my face entirely blank. Diane let out another piercing wail from the floor, burying her face in her hands. "She was terrified of you, Dad." Bradley continued, his voice dripping with righteous indignation. "She knew your explosive temper. She knew that if she told you about the ransom demand, you would have tried to take control. You would have called your security team. You would have involved the police. You would have turned the entire thing into a tactical war zone, and the kidnappers would have panicked. She was a desperate, terrified mother trying to do everything in her power to save her innocent little boy from a horrific situation. So she made a choice. She went to the bank the very next morning. She withdrew the money exactly as they instructed. She drove to a designated drop point at the edge of the city and left the briefcase in a dumpster, praying they would give her son back. Bradley stopped pacing and stood right in front of me, leaning in slightly to emphasize his next words. "But they took the cash, Dad. They took the money, and they never brought Leo home. The next day you noticed he was missing from the yard, the police were called, and the circus began." She was too ashamed, too utterly broken by her failure to ever admit what she had done. She has carried the guilt of that failed ransom drop every single day for 30 years. And you are standing here interrogating her like she is a criminal. Diane scrambled up from the floor, leaning heavily against the island for support. Her mascara was smeared down her cheeks, and her silk blouse was stained with spilled wine. She threw herself toward me, wrapping her arms around my waist, collapsing to her knees right at my feet. "I am so sorry," "Richard," she wailed, burying her face into my coat. "I am so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing. I just wanted my baby back. I thought if I just paid them, they would let him go. Please forgive me. It was just foolish motherly desperation. I was so scared of what you would do. I did not want him to die because of your pride. Please, you have to believe me." Her tears soaked through the fabric of my trousers. The entire display was sickeningly pathetic. From the doorway of the kitchen, another voice suddenly sliced through the heavy emotional atmosphere. "Oh, for heaven's sake, Richard." I turned my head and saw Valerie, my daughter-in-law, leaning against the doorframe. She was wearing a silk robe, casually filing her nails, as if this entire situation were nothing more than a minor inconvenience interrupting her evening. "You are terrorizing your own wife over a scam artist's fake document," Valerie muttered, rolling her eyes dramatically. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous you look right now? Some grifter from a coffee shop hands you a piece of paper and you come storming in here acting like a dictator, traumatizing a woman who has already lost a child. You really should be ashamed of yourself, Richard. Grow up." I looked at Valerie, taking in her sheer arrogance and her total disrespect, then looked down at the weeping woman clinging to my legs. Every fiber of my being wanted to push Diane away, to demand answers, to tear this house apart until the truth bled out. But a successful businessman knows when to fold a bad hand. I let out a long breath, forcing my shoulders to drop. I reached down and gently pulled Diane up from the floor. I wrapped my arms around her trembling frame. I stroked her hair, murmuring soft apologies. "I am sorry, Diane," I whispered, making sure my voice sounded suitably broken and full of regret. "I am so sorry. You are right. I should not have reacted this way. I was just so shocked by the document. I know you were only trying to protect our boy. Please forgive me." As Diane wept into my chest, gripping my jacket, I opened my eyes. I looked over her shoulder at my son. Bradley was standing a few feet away, watching the reconciliation unfold. For a fraction of a second, his protective facade completely slipped. He caught my gaze. Then he shifted his eyes toward his wife in the doorway. He gave Valerie a quick, almost imperceptible smirk. It was a fleeting expression of absolute triumph, the look of a predator who had just successfully cornered his prey. That tiny, arrogant micro-expression told me everything I needed to know. My 40 years of ruthless corporate instincts screamed violently inside my head. I knew in my bones that they were both lying to my face. The ransom story was just a perfectly fabricated, calculated illusion designed to manipulate and deceive me. They were deliberately hiding something truly monstrous, and I was going to uncover every single dark, rotting secret they had buried. That evening, the grand house on Beacon Hill settled into a heavy, suffocating silence. Diane retreated to the master bedroom early, claiming a migraine, clutching a glass of water and her prescribed sedatives. I played the supportive, chastised husband flawlessly. I helped her into bed, pulled the heavy duvet over her trembling shoulders, and turned off the lamps. I lay there in the dark, perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic sound of her breathing as the medication finally pulled her under. Hours dragged by. The rain continued to lash against the bedroom windows, a relentless drumming that matched the pounding in my chest. When the illuminated numbers on the digital clock shifted to 2 in the morning, I finally moved. I slid out from under the covers with practiced silence. I did not bother with slippers or a robe. The cold hardwood floor bit into the soles of my feet as I navigated the sprawling, darkened hallways of the estate. Every shadow seemed to mock me, every luxurious fixture a reminder of the empire I had built for people who were completely deceiving me. I bypassed the main staircase and used the secondary elevator, stepping out into the secluded wing that housed my private study. This room was my sanctuary, heavily soundproofed and strictly off-limits to everyone, including Diane and the cleaning staff. I locked the heavy oak door behind me and closed the velvet blinds, plunging the room into absolute pitch black before reaching under the mahogany desk. I bypassed the sleek modern laptop sitting on the surface and pressed a concealed panel near the floorboard. A hidden drawer slid open, revealing an older, heavily encrypted terminal that I kept strictly air-gapped from our main corporate network. As a man who built a global logistics network, I never threw away foundational data. This terminal held the unalterable hard-coded financial archives of the Caldwell Family Trust, dating back to the very inception of my fortune. I powered the machine on. The low hum of the cooling fan felt loud in the total isolation of the study. The screen flickered to life, casting a harsh, pale blue glow across my face. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I had to bypass 3 separate security protocols and a biometric prompt before the antiquated database finally granted me access. My hands were remarkably steady now. The initial shock from the coffee shop had completely burned away, leaving behind a cold, clinical precision. I navigated through decades of financial history, scrolling past real estate acquisitions, massive shipping contracts, and philanthropic donations. I narrowed the search parameters to the spring of 1996. I entered the exact date stamped on the withdrawal slip the stranger had pushed across the cafe table. The system processed the query lines of green text cascading down the dark screen. And there it was. The $250,000 transaction. Diane had not lied about the amount, nor had she lied about the date. But as I stared at the digital ledger, my eyes narrowed. I was a man who moved thousands of shipping containers across the globe daily. I understood tracking. I understood the digital footprints that money always leaves behind. Bradley had spun a highly compelling narrative in the kitchen. He had painted a picture of a terrified mother, pulling $250,000 in untraceable paper bills to drop into a dirty suburban dumpster. It was a very tragic cinematic story of desperation. But the cold, hard data glowing on the screen told an entirely different tale. The transaction code listed next to the amount was not for a physical cash withdrawal. It was a wire transfer code. My heart seized in my chest. You cannot wire cash to an anonymous kidnapper hiding in a park. Wire transfers require routing numbers, international SWIFT codes, and registered receiving entities. I tapped the keyboard, expanding the transaction details to reveal the destination of the funds. The screen flickered again, loading the archived banking route. The $250,000 had been electronically funneled through 3 different intermediary banks before finally settling into an offshore corporate account based in the Cayman Islands. The beneficiary name attached to that account was not a person. It was a shell company. I leaned closer to the monitor, reading the name aloud in the silent room. Apex Holdings. My breath hitched. The entire ransom drop story was an absolute fabrication. Diane did not leave cash in a dumpster for kidnappers. She wired a massive fortune to a ghost corporation. The sheer calculation required to execute that kind of financial maneuver completely contradicted the image of a panicked, grieving mother. I stared at the name Apex Holdings, letting the reality wash over me. But then a bizarre, nagging sensation crept into the back of my mind. The name of the shell company felt strangely familiar. The sickening familiarity was recent. It was something I had seen in passing, something buried deep in the endless spreadsheets I reviewed every single quarter. I rolled over to the modern laptop sitting on the desk. I opened it and logged into the active financial servers of my logistics empire. My hands were practically numb as I typed the name Apex Holdings into the global vendor search bar. I slowly hit the enter key. The system froze for a fraction of a second, processing the search across our vast network of international partners, suppliers, and consultants. Then the results populated the screen. I stopped breathing. The page was flooded with hundreds of line items. Apex Holdings was not a defunct entity from 1996. It was an active, highly compensated vendor in our current corporate ecosystem. I clicked on the most recent fiscal year and sorted the payments. Every single month, on the 15th day, a scheduled payment of $50,000 was wired from our central operating account directly to Apex Holdings. I scrolled down looking at the previous year. The exact same pattern, $50,000 a month. I expanded the search to a decade. For the last 10 years, my company had been steadily bleeding $500,000 annually to the exact same offshore shell company that received the supposed ransom money the day before my son vanished. I dragged my cursor over to the authorization column. I needed to see whose digital signature was approving these massive recurring payments. I already knew the answer in my gut, but seeing the name officially stamped on the ledger felt like a physical knife plunging into my stomach. The authorizing officer for every single transaction over the last decade was Bradley Caldwell. My son, my chief financial officer, the man who was supposed to inherit my entire legacy, had been meticulously funneling a fortune to the same entity tied to his brother's disappearance. Bradley was not protecting his mother from an old mistake. He was actively paying someone off right now. The silent, dark room suddenly spun violently around my head. My own son was deeply, inextricably linked to the darkest horror of my entire life, and he was using my hard-earned money to finance it. The sun rose over Boston the next morning, casting a pale gray light that offered absolutely no warmth. I had not slept a single minute. I spent the remaining hours of the night sitting in the dark of my study, staring at the glowing screen of the legacy terminal. Every time I blinked, I saw the offshore routing numbers. Every time I inhaled, I felt the crushing weight of the betrayal pressing down on my chest. But as the clock struck 6, I forced myself to stand. I walked to my private bathroom, splashed freezing water on my face, and dressed in my sharpest charcoal suit. A successful man does not go to war looking defeated. He goes to war looking like he owns the battlefield. I drove to the corporate headquarters of Caldwell Logistics, a towering glass and steel monolith in the financial district that I had built from a single delivery truck. When I walked through the revolving doors into the expansive marble lobby, I projected the exact same aura I had carried for 40 years. I nodded to the security guards. I smiled at the receptionists. I stepped into the private executive elevator and rode it to the top floor, acting entirely like a man whose world was in perfect order. Inside, my mind was running 1,000 calculations a second. I needed to see Bradley. I needed to look him in the eye now that I knew the truth about Apex Holdings. When the elevator doors parted on the executive floor, the plush carpet silenced my footsteps. I walked past the mahogany-paneled conference rooms toward the West Wing, where Bradley reigned as my chief financial officer. His administrative assistant was away from her desk, likely fetching his morning coffee. As I approached his heavy oak door, I realized I needed a plausible excuse for entering unannounced. I reached into my breast pocket, pulled out my reading glasses, and slipped them into the inner lining of my jacket. I would simply tell him I had left them in his suite during our meeting the previous afternoon. It was a mundane, trivial excuse perfectly suited for an aging father. I raised my hand to push the heavy door open, but I stopped. The door was already cracked open just a fraction of an inch, and I could hear voices drifting from inside. It was not just Bradley. Valerie was in there with him. This was highly unusual. My daughter-in-law despised the corporate office, finding it boring and beneath her socialite sensibilities. I stood perfectly still, pressing my back against the wall, just outside the frame, completely hidden from their line of sight. "You should have seen him," Valerie Bradley was saying. His voice was casual, almost amused, carrying the distinct tone of a man recounting a funny anecdote at a cocktail party. The old man bought the ransom story completely. He practically swallowed it whole. He spent 10 minutes on the floor, apologizing to Mom for upsetting her. I closed my eyes. The sheer casual cruelty in my son's voice was a physical strike. Valerie let out a sharp, dismissive sigh. "Thank God for that. I thought your mother was going to ruin everything. When she dropped that wine glass, I thought she was going to confess the whole thing right there. She is so incredibly weak, Bradley. She is a liability. If Richard had pushed her for even 2 more minutes, she would have cracked." "Mom is a mess," Bradley replied smoothly, the sound of ice clinking against glass echoing in the room. "But she will hold up. She has to." She is too terrified of losing her social standing to ever tell the truth. She knows I am the only thing standing between her and a prison cell. I pressed my hand flat against the cool wall to steady myself. The marble felt like ice, but my blood was boiling. Prison. What could Diane have possibly done 30 years ago that would warrant a prison sentence? Kidnappers did not send grieving mothers to prison. So what is the next move? Valerie asked, her voice laced with heavy impatience. Because I am not spending another month tiptoeing around that massive house pretending to care about his feelings. That encounter yesterday was far too close. What if that scammer tries to approach him again? Tommy is not going to approach him again, Bradley said firmly, saying the name that I had never heard before. Tommy. The stranger in the coffee shop had a name. I already wired Tommy his extra consulting fee through the offshore account. He knows the drill. He gets his monthly payout to keep his mouth shut, and he stays far away from Boston. Yesterday was just a warning shot because his payment was 2 days late. I handled it. The puzzle pieces slammed together in my mind with blinding clarity. Bradley knew the man in the coffee shop. Bradley was paying him off. My son was using my money to finance the extortion of my own family. You need to finalize this, Bradley. Valerie demanded, the sound of her heels clicking as she paced across his office floor. We have been waiting for years. I am tired of waiting. When is he officially handing over the reins? Next month, Bradley answered, his tone shifting to one of supreme arrogance. The board meets on the 15th. Dad has already drawn up the succession paperwork. He is transferring the chief executive title and his voting shares to me. We just need to keep paying Tommy until that signature is on the dotted line. Once I have the company, everything changes. And what about Richard? Valerie asked. He is not just going to step aside and plant a garden. He is too controlling. I held my breath, waiting for my son's answer. I waited to hear how the boy I had raised, the boy I had loved and protected, planned to handle his aging father. I have already spoken to a specialist, Bradley said, his voice entirely devoid of any warmth or familial affection. After the transfer, we start laying the groundwork. We document the outbursts. We highlight his obsession with a 30-year-old kidnapping. We slowly build a medical file that points to severe cognitive decline, early onset dementia, paranoia. By the end of the year, I will have medical power of attorney. We will quietly lock Dad in an upscale memory care facility in upstate New York. He will be out of the way, Mom will be under my thumb, and we will finally have complete control of the empire. I stopped breathing. The hallway around me seemed to stretch and distort. My son was not just hiding a horrible 30-year-old secret. He was actively, deliberately extorting his own mother. He was financing the man who had tormented me in the coffee shop. And he was meticulously planning to medically incarcerate me in a psychiatric ward, stripping away my freedom, my mind, and my entire life's work. For a long moment, I stood completely paralyzed outside the oak door. I thought about the decades I had spent sacrificing my own peace of mind to build a fortune large enough to protect them. I thought about the nights I had stayed awake agonizing over where my missing boy was, while my eldest son secretly siphoned my money to bury the truth. Then something inside me irrevocably snapped. The profound, crushing sadness that had defined my life for 30 years completely vanished. The grief evaporated. The confusion burned away. In its place, a cold, calculating, and absolute rage flooded my veins. It was a pure, unadulterated fury that cleared my mind and sharpened my senses to a razor's edge. Bradley thought he was dealing with a clueless, grieving old man. He thought I was a fragile relic who could be easily manipulated with a few tears and a plausible story. He had fundamentally forgotten who I was. He had forgotten that before I was a grieving father, I was a predator in the boardroom. I had crushed men 10 times smarter and far more ruthless than him. I stepped away from the door in utter silence. I did not barge in. I did not scream. Confronting him now would only alert him to his mistake. I needed him to believe his plan was working perfectly. I needed him to feel completely safe right up until the moment I tore his entire world apart. I turned and walked back down the plush carpet of the executive hallway, my face set in stone, ready to dismantle the very family I had spent my life protecting. I would ensure they regretted the day they crossed me. I pushed the heavy oak door open, making sure my hand trembled violently against the brass handle. I let my shoulders slump forward instantly, adopting the exhausted frame of an aging man. I stumbled slightly as I crossed the threshold of Bradley's office, dragging my feet against the plush carpet. I raised my left hand and clutched the fabric of my suit jacket tightly over my chest. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged, letting out a weak gasp. Bradley was sitting behind his massive mahogany desk, reviewing a spreadsheet. He looked up, his expression initially flashing with deep annoyance at the unannounced interruption, before he masked it with a look of dutiful concern. He stood up abruptly, pushing his leather chair back. "Dad," he asked, his voice laced with manufactured worry. "What is wrong? Are you all right?" I leaned against a leather guest chair, letting out a long exhale. I pressed 2 fingers to my temple, closing my eyes tightly, as if fighting off intense dizziness. "I need a moment," I whispered, letting my voice crack perfectly. "My heart is racing, Bradley. It feels like a snare drum in my chest. I cannot seem to catch my breath today." Bradley rushed around his desk, placing a steadying hand on my back. He guided me into the chair, playing the role of the devoted, terrified son flawlessly. He poured a glass of water and handed it to me. I took it with shaking hands, letting a few drops spill to sell the performance. "Sip it slowly." "Dad," he instructed gently, "do you want me to call a doctor? Should I call for an ambulance? Call for war?" I shook my head weakly, taking a slow sip of the cold water. "No," I rasped, leaning my head back against the leather upholstery. "It is not a heart attack. It is just stress. It is the absolute crushing stress of everything that has happened over the last 24 hours. I opened my eyes and looked at my son, projecting an image of total defeat. "That man in the coffee shop, Bradley." I continued, my voice wavering. "The things he said, the document he showed me. It brought all the agony of losing Leo rushing back to the surface. I feel like I am drowning in it again. Seeing that picture and hearing those lies broke something inside me. I cannot function like this. I cannot lead this company when my mind is completely consumed by ghosts from 30 years ago." I watched his face closely. Beneath the mask of filial concern, I saw the undeniable spark of hungry anticipation ignite in his eyes. I let out another weary sigh. "I spoke to my cardiologist this morning." I lied smoothly. "He told me my blood pressure is dangerously high. He said if I do not disconnect immediately, I am going to have a massive stroke. I need to get away, Bradley. I need complete silence and isolation. I am going to take the private jet up to the Hamptons. I am going to spend the next 2 weeks at the oceanfront estate, completely disconnected from the grid. No phones, no emails, no corporate emergencies. Just absolute rest." Bradley nodded sympathetically, though his grip on my shoulder tightened with sheer excitement. "You need to listen to your doctor, Dad," he said smoothly. "Your health comes first. Mom and I will handle whatever that extortionist tries to do next. We will protect you." I looked up at him, offering a weak, grateful smile. "I know you will, son," I whispered. "But I need you to do more than that. I cannot leave the firm rudderless for 2 weeks right before the end of the fiscal quarter. Effective immediately, you have full operational control of the company. You sign the checks and you approve the contracts. Consider it a trial run for your promotion next month." The greed that washed over his face was so potent, it was almost sickening. He tried to suppress his smile, biting the inside of his cheek, but the raw ambition radiated from him like heat. "Are you sure, Dad?" he asked, feigning hesitation. "I am absolutely sure," I replied, standing up slowly. "The company is yours for the next 2 weeks. Do not let me down." I left the corporate headquarters and had my driver take me back to Beacon Hill. When I walked into the mansion, I continued playing the broken, ailing patriarch. I found Diane in the master suite. When I told her about my supposed medical episode and the doctor's strict orders to retreat to the Hamptons, she immediately sprang into action. She was the picture of a doting, terrified wife. She rushed to her massive walk-in closet, pulling out my finest linen shirts, my cashmere sweaters, and my tailored trousers, meticulously folding them into my leather travel bags. "Oh, Richard," she murmured, her voice trembling with perfectly calibrated anxiety. "You scared me so much yesterday. I cannot bear the thought of losing you to a heart attack. You have to rest. I will stay here and make sure everything at the house runs smoothly. You just focus on breathing the ocean air and getting your strength back." I stood in the doorway of the closet, watching her pack my clothes. I looked at the same hands that had signed the withdrawal slip to bury my 4-year-old son. Her tears were shed not for the child she discarded, but for the luxurious life she was trying to protect. A wave of absolute revulsion churned in my gut. I wanted to scream at her. I wanted to grab her by the shoulders and demand the truth. But I simply stepped forward and kissed her gently on the forehead. "Thank you, Diane," I said quietly. "I do not know what I would do without you." She smiled, patting my chest. "Just get better, my love," she whispered. "Just get better." An hour later, my private chauffeur loaded my luggage into the trunk of the town car. As we pulled away, I watched Diane through the tinted window. The moment she thought I was out of sight, her posture completely changed. Her worried shoulders relaxed, and the look of concern vanished, replaced by a cold emptiness. She turned and walked back inside, closing the heavy oak door. I raised the soundproof partition. I pulled out my phone and dialed my chief of aviation. "I need a change of flight plan." I instructed, my voice shedding all traces of weakness. "We are not flying to the Hamptons. Reroute the jet immediately. We are going to Washington." I was not seeking rest. I was seeking a weapon. 2 hours later, I walked into an office blocks away from the federal courthouses. Sitting behind a massive desk was Victor Thorne, a ruthless former prosecutor who owed me his career. He stood up, evaluating my face. "Richard," he said smoothly, shaking my hand, "you look like a man preparing for a war." I gripped his hand. "I am not preparing for a war, Victor," I replied. "I am preparing for an execution." Victor Thorne held court in a conference room that operated like a secure fortress. It was positioned exactly 3 floors beneath the busy streets of Washington, a subterranean bunker completely encased in thick, soundproof acoustic paneling and heavily frosted glass. I stood silently at the head of the massive obsidian table, pulling the fragile contents from my leather briefcase. I laid out the printed ledgers from my legacy mainframe, spreading the sensitive documents across the dark wood like an old general arranging a map for a final desperate battle. I carefully placed the faded withdrawal slip right next to the modern offshore wire transfer codes. Victor stood closely beside me, his sharp dark eyes intensely scanning the highlighted columns. He had spent 15 grueling years as a federal prosecutor, systematically dismantling organized crime syndicates before shifting to private practice. And he knew exactly what he was looking at. He traced the hidden root of the $50,000 monthly payments with his silver fountain pen, his jaw clenching tightly as he connected the dates. He did not offer any empty platitudes or fake sympathy. He simply looked at me, fully understanding the absolute magnitude of the familial betrayal. "Your own son, Victor," murmured, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble that echoed in the quiet room. "He has been running a highly sophisticated extortion ring directly through your primary corporate accounts, bleeding you dry right beneath your nose." I nodded slowly, leaning heavily against the polished edge of the table to steady my trembling legs. "I need to dismantle his entire operation tonight, Victor." I stated, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth. "I need to sever his access to my empire immediately. And I need to know exactly who this Tommy character is. I want every single private communication between Bradley and Valerie monitored around the clock. I want to know exactly what they are planning before they even have the chance to think it." Victor did not hesitate for a single second. He walked straight over to the secure intercom panel embedded in the wall and firmly pressed a silver button. "Send the specialists in right now," he instructed. Less than a minute later, the heavy reinforced steel door swung open. Two men entered the room carrying heavy military-grade metallic cases. Victor introduced them simply as former federal agents who specialized entirely in digital forensics and corporate espionage. They were men who existed entirely off the grid, men who knew how to crack a secure digital vault without leaving a single trace. I gave them my explicit, unrestricted legal authorization to completely penetrate the Caldwell logistics network. I handed them my master administrative credentials, granting them the highest level of access in the company. The specialists worked with terrifying methodical speed. They rapidly established a highly secure uplink to my corporate servers and began systematically bypassing the expensive firewalls Bradley mistakenly thought he controlled. Within 30 minutes, they had successfully executed a shadow clone of Bradley and his active corporate laptop. They seamlessly mirrored his entire hard drive, instantly capturing every encrypted file, every hidden spreadsheet, and every offshore account routing sequence he had buried. But they did not stop there. Using the administrative backdoor I provided, they infiltrated the mobile carrier networks, establishing a real-time intercept on the personal mobile phones of both Bradley and Valerie. Lines of intercepted text messages immediately began to scroll rapidly across the massive digital monitor mounted on the conference room wall. I stood in total silence, reading the absolute venom my son and his wife were casually exchanging. Bradley had texted Valerie just an hour ago. "The old man is completely isolated in the Hamptons. His doctor says his heart is failing fast. The board meeting is in 2 weeks. Start looking at the brochures for that memory care facility. We need to secure a room in their restricted ward." Valerie replied almost instantly. "Make sure it is the facility with 0 visitation rights. I do not want to deal with his complaints when we sell his ridiculous estate." Reading those cruel words felt like swallowing broken glass, but I welcomed the sharp pain. The pain actively fueled the cold mechanical rage that was currently keeping me standing. I turned away from the glowing monitor and looked directly at Victor. "It is time to starve them," I declared, my voice echoing sharply in the bunker. "I want to initiate a complete unannounced financial freeze on all trust accounts, personal liquid assets, and discretionary corporate funds that Bradley currently believes he controls." Victor nodded in agreement, immediately pulling out a thick stack of legal authorization forms. "We will construct a phantom trust," Victor explained, his pen flying rapidly across the complex documents. "I am going to secretly transfer 80% of your core liquid fortune into a newly formed, completely blind holding company. Bradley will still see the massive account balances on his screen, but it will be a complete digital mirage. The funds will be completely locked down, requiring your physical biometric signature to move a single cent. He will not realize the money is completely inaccessible until he tries to execute his next massive transfer. Furthermore, I instructed my mind, rapidly calculating the value of the real estate portfolio. I want you to quietly liquidate the Beacon Hill estate, the Winter Lodge in Aspen, and the private aviation fleet. Sell them to anonymous buyers under strict non-disclosure agreements. Keep the leasebacks active for 30 days, so they suspect absolutely nothing. When Bradley tries to seize my physical assets after his little board meeting, he will find out he is attempting to claim ownership of properties I no longer own. I am going to leave him with absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the impending weight of a massive federal indictment." Victor handed me the final document. I signed my name with a heavy definitive stroke, officially executing the silent financial guillotine. As I handed the pen back, one of the cyber specialists suddenly cleared his throat. The sound shattered the focused silence of the room. "Mr. Caldwell," the agent said, his eyes fixed on the rapid scrolling code on his secondary monitor. "We just broke through the final layer of offshore encryption on the Cayman Islands account. We have the true ownership registry for Apex Holdings." I walked over to his workstation, planting my hands firmly on the desk. "Who is it?" I demanded, my heart hammering violently against my ribs. "Who is receiving my money?" The agent clicked a key, and a high-resolution scanned document appeared on the screen. It was a corporate formation charter from 1996. The name of the registered owner was printed in bold black letters. Gregory Barnes. I stared at the name, the breath completely leaving my lungs. The room started to spin. Gregory Barnes was not an anonymous kidnapper. He was not a dangerous, unknown criminal. Gregory Barnes was the man who had served as the private chauffeur for the Caldwell family for over 20 years. He died exactly a year ago. The arrogant grifter Bradley called Tommy was his son Thomas Barnes. The revelation hit me with the force of a freight train. Gregory Barnes. The man had driven my cars, carried my groceries, and smiled at my missing son. He stood quietly in the background of my life for over 2 decades. He offered me his solemn condolences when the police suspended the search for Leo. All the while, he was the ghost behind Apex Holdings. He was the architect of the fake ransom drop, bleeding my empire dry while driving me to corporate meetings. Now his son Thomas Barnes had inherited the family business of extorting the Caldwells. I did not stay in Washington a moment longer. I instructed Victor to maintain the financial lockdown and keep the cyber team monitoring every digital breath my son took. I boarded my private jet under the cover of darkness, flying back to Boston, completely off the radar. The flight was a blur of icy rage. Using the intercepted data from Bradley's cloned laptop, I extracted the burner phone number my son used to communicate with the blackmailer. I did not involve the police. I did not involve security. This was a cancer that required a highly precise personal excision. Upon landing in Boston, I drove directly to an industrial district near the shipping ports. I owned a vast array of properties, including a decommissioned logistics warehouse that sat vacant on the edge of the harbor. It was a cavernous structure of rusting steel and cracked concrete, far removed from the pristine marble of Beacon Hill. It was the perfect stage for a reckoning. I sat in the cold, damp office overlooking the warehouse floor and pulled out a fresh, untraceable mobile phone. I sent a single, precise text message to Tommy. It read, "I know about the $2 million lump sum demand. Bradley is out. I am taking over the payments. Meet me at Pier 4 warehouse in 1 hour. Come alone." I knew from intercepted texts that Tommy was pressing Bradley for a massive payout of $2 million to disappear for good. Bradley was stalling, trying to string the grifter along until the corporate takeover was complete. But Tommy was impatient and reckless. I counted on that greed to override his survival instincts. I unlocked the heavy iron safe in the warehouse office, a relic from my early days of managing cash payrolls. I pulled out 10 banded stacks of $100 bills, $100,000 in sequential crisp currency. I packed the money into a sleek metallic briefcase and snapped the latches shut. The heavy clack echoed loudly in the vast empty space. I walked down the metal stairs to the main floor, the only illumination coming from a single floodlight hanging from the high ceiling. I placed the briefcase on a rusted shipping crate in the center of the pool of light. Then I stood in the shadows, waiting for the ghost of my past to arrive. Exactly 50 minutes later, the heavy corrugated metal doors at the front of the warehouse rattled loudly. A black sports car pulled into the building, its engine roaring unnecessarily before being cut off. The headlights illuminated the dusty air, casting long, menacing shadows against the walls. The driver's side door swung open, and Tommy stepped out onto the concrete floor. He was a tall, heavily built man in his late 30s, wearing a tailored leather jacket over a dark t-shirt. He walked with a swaggering, arrogant confidence that made my blood boil. As he stepped into the circle of light, I finally got a clear look at his face. There was a faint resemblance to my wife Diane around the jawline, a calculated detail he had exploited. But the arrogant tilt of his chin and the cold calculation in his eyes belonged entirely to his father, the chauffeur who had betrayed me. Tommy looked around the empty warehouse, a smug smile spreading across his face. He clearly believed he held all the cards. He thought he had a terrified, broken old man trapped in an inescapable web of family secrets. "Well, well, well," Tommy called out, his voice echoing loudly in the cavernous space. The great Richard Caldwell stepping out of his ivory tower to do business in the dirt. I have to admit, I was surprised when you texted. I figured Bradley would try to keep you shielded from the ugly truth until he had you locked up in that fancy nursing home. I stepped out of the shadows, walking slowly into the light. I did not react to his deliberate provocation. I kept my face entirely neutral, projecting an aura of absolute terrifying control. I stopped a few feet away from the shipping crate, looking him directly in the eye. You demanded $2 million from my son, I stated, my voice low and completely steady. You promised that if you received that lump sum, you would take your fabricated story and disappear forever. Tommy chuckled, running a hand through his hair. It is not a fabricated story, Richard. We both know that. Mom paid the ransom, but the bad guys did not give me back. It is a real tragedy. But hey, I survived, and now I just want my fair share of the family pie. Bradley agreed to the $2 million. If you are stepping in for him, I expect the full amount tonight. Otherwise, the press gets an interesting story about the missing Caldwell heir returning. I reached out and placed my hand flat on the top of the metallic briefcase. I popped the latches with my thumbs. The lid sprang open, revealing the thick stacks of cash. There is exactly $100,000 in this case, I said, keeping my gaze locked entirely on his face. Tommy frowned, his smug expression faltering for a fraction of a second. He looked down at the money, then back up at me. That is not $2 million, old man. That is an insult. Do you really want to test me? I did not blink. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a sterile, sealed medical tube containing a single cotton swab. I tossed it onto the stacks of cash. You get the rest of the money when you give me a DNA sample right now, I demanded, my voice turning to sharpened steel. You can play your little psychological games with Diane. You can extort Bradley because he is a coward. But I do not buy your story for a single second. I do not buy that you are Leo. Swab your cheek or walk out of here with absolutely nothing. Tommy stared at the medical tube. For a moment, the heavy silence of the warehouse pressed down on us. Then the arrogant grifter threw his head back and laughed loudly. He reached down, ripped open the plastic packaging, and scraped the cotton swab aggressively against the inside of his cheek. He tossed the damp swab back onto the table, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. You are a smart guy, Richard. Tommy smirked, grabbing the handle of the briefcase. Smarter than your wife, anyway. I watched him drive away, dispatching the fresh swab to a highly private rapid testing laboratory. The wait for the laboratory results felt like wading through wet concrete. I had relocated from the damp warehouse to an anonymous suite overlooking the Charles River. Victor Thorne and his cyber specialists had transformed the room into a digital command center. The large windows were blacked out. The plush bed was covered in financial ledgers. The focal point was a bank of monitors mounted along the wall, silently broadcasting a live feed from inside my home. Before I left for my fabricated retreat, Victor's operatives had bypassed the perimeter security of my estate. Under the guise of a network upgrade, they had seamlessly embedded microscopic motion, activated cameras, and highly sensitive audio receivers in every primary living space. The kitchen, foyer, living room, and master suite were now entirely exposed. I sat in an armchair in the dim suite, my eyes locked onto the glowing screens. I was a ghost haunting my own house. For the first 24 hours, the feeds showed exactly what I expected. The house was quiet, meticulously maintained by the daytime staff. But as the sun set and the staff departed, the true reality of my wife's existence became painfully clear. Diane was unraveling. The fragile facade she had so carefully maintained in my presence completely shattered the moment I supposedly boarded a flight. I watched her on the monitor dedicated to the main living room. The grand space was illuminated only by the flickering light of the stone fireplace. Diane was pacing the length of the Persian rug, her steps erratic. She wore a silk robe that hung loosely from her thin frame. In her hand, she gripped a large crystal tumbler filled with dark amber liquid. It was straight bourbon from my private reserve, and she was drinking it with the desperate urgency of a person trying to drown a raging fire in her mind. Her hands trembled so violently that the liquor sloshed over the rim of the glass. She walked to the bay windows, staring out into the dark courtyard, muttering frantically to herself. The audio feeds picked up panicked whispers. She was terrified. She kept looking over her shoulder. I sat in my room watching the woman I had protected over 4 decades, feeling an icy void where my sympathy used to reside. She was not a victim. She was a co-conspirator being crushed by her deceit. Around midnight, the motion sensors in the grand foyer flashed green on my panel. The heavy front doors clicked open. Bradley stepped into the entryway, shaking the rain from his coat. He walked through the house with the arrogant stride of a man who already believed he owned the property. He found his mother in the living room. Diane practically collapsed against the sofa when he walked in, letting out a sharp gasp. Bradley did not offer a comforting hug. He simply stood near the threshold, looking at her with profound, clinical disgust. "You need to pull yourself together, Mom," Bradley commanded, his voice cold and flat. "You are a mess. The staff is going to start asking questions if they find you wandering around like a drunken ghost every morning." Diane shook her head frantically, raising the trembling glass to her lips. She took a desperate gulp. "I cannot do this anymore, Bradley," she sobbed, her voice raw. "I cannot sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see that man. I see the bank receipt. Your father knows something is wrong. He is not a fool. He is sitting up in the Hamptons right now, but I know he is thinking about it. He is going to keep digging." "He is not digging anywhere," Bradley snapped, pouring himself a small scotch. "He bought the ransom story completely. He is exactly where I want him, isolated and utterly dependent on me to run the company. You just need to hold your nerve for a few more weeks." Diane lunged forward, her face twisted in absolute terror. She grabbed the lapels of his leather coat, her knuckles turning white. "You do not understand," she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply. "The ransom story will not hold up if he looks too closely. If Richard finds out what really happened that day at the lake, he will kill me. He will absolutely kill me." I stopped breathing. The air in my room turned instantly to ice. I stared at the monitor, my mind violently rejecting the words that had just left her mouth. The lake. For 30 agonizing years, the official narrative of my son's disappearance had been etched into my soul and into the police reports. Diane had told the detectives that she had taken 4-year-old Leo to the crowded Chestnut Hill shopping mall. She said she had turned her back for a mere 10 seconds to pay for a toy at a kiosk, and when she turned around, the stroller was empty. He was gone. Swallowed by the crowd. The police had scoured the mall and reviewed grainy security footage. The entire investigation had been based on a busy commercial center. There was never a lake. The lake was an entirely different location, an isolated summer cabin we owned miles away from the city, a place we had supposedly not visited in the weeks leading up to the kidnapping. Bradley did not flinch at her words. He forcefully peeled his mother's trembling hands off his coat, pushing her back with a disturbing lack of effort. He stepped closer to her, invading her personal space, towering over her fragile frame. "He won't," Bradley replied, his voice dropping to a menacing, lethal whisper. "Because you are going to keep your mouth shut. You are going to smile, you are going to take your pills, and you are going to play the grieving widow perfectly. Because if you break Mom, if you say one wrong word to him, I will stop paying Tommy. I will let Tommy take his evidence straight to the district attorney. And you will spend your final years locked in a federal penitentiary for what you did. Do you understand me?" Diane whimpered, sinking down onto the cushions of the sofa, curling in on herself like a beaten animal. She nodded slowly, burying her tear-stained face in her hands. "Good," Bradley sneered, turning his back on her. "I am finalizing the corporate transfer paperwork tomorrow. Just stay out of my way." He walked out of the room, leaving his mother weeping in the dim light of the dying fire. I sat frozen in the armchair of my hotel suite, the digital audio static hissing softly through the speakers. My hands gripped the armrests tightly. The magnitude of the deception was massive to process. My son was not merely a greedy executive stealing corporate funds. He was a ruthless blackmailer actively extorting his own mother. He was holding the threat of federal prison over her head to secure his inheritance. But the most horrifying revelation was the geographical slip that shattered 3 decades of accepted reality. The lake. She was the architect of a massive cover-up. I would tear down every lie until I found my son. The morning sun climbed over the Charles River, casting long beams of light into the darkened suite, where I had spent the night watching the destruction of my family unfold on the surveillance monitors. The revelation about the lake still echoed in my mind, a toxic secret that completely unraveled the very foundation of my life. Diane and Bradley had lied about the mall. They had lied about the ransom. They had lied about everything. I turned off the monitors, plunging the room back into absolute silence. The time for watching was over. The time for answers had finally arrived. A sharp knock on the hotel suite door pulled me from my dark thoughts. I walked across the plush carpet and opened the door. Victor Thorne stood in the hallway, his face unreadable, holding a thick, sealed manila envelope. His presence was a stark reminder of the cold reality waiting for me. I stepped aside, letting him enter the room. He walked directly to the small glass dining table and placed the envelope down. The rapid testing laboratory finished the analysis an hour ago, Victor stated, his voice completely devoid of any inflection. They worked through the night to run a full genetic comparison against the DNA profile you provided from your medical records. The results are definitive, Richard. There is absolutely no margin for error. I stared at the heavy envelope. It felt like a ticking bomb resting on the glass surface. For 30 years, a tiny buried part of my soul had desperately clung to the impossible hope that my little boy was still alive out there in the world. Even though I knew the man in the coffee shop was an arrogant grifter, even though I knew he was the son of my deceased chauffeur, the physical evidence was the final nail in the coffin of my hope. I reached out and picked up the envelope. I broke the seal with my thumb, pulling out the single sheet of official laboratory paper. My eyes immediately scanned the complex scientific jargon, searching for the final conclusion printed at the very bottom of the page. The words were stark and entirely merciless. Probability of paternity is 0%. There were no shared genetic markers, no biological connection whatsoever. The man who had demanded $2 million from my son, the man who was currently bleeding my corporate accounts dry through a phantom offshore company, was absolutely not Leo. He was Tommy Barnes. He was nothing more than a parasite feeding off the rotting corpse of my family tragedy. I placed the paper back onto the table. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a tremendous, overwhelming sense of clarity. The board was fully set, and I knew exactly who the players were. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out the untraceable burner phone I had used to contact the extortionist at the warehouse. I dialed the number, putting the phone on speaker so Victor could listen to the conversation. The line rang 3 times before it clicked open. "Did you bring the rest of the money?" Old man Tommy asked, his voice dripping with that same unbearable, swaggering arrogance. "Because I am getting really tired of waiting for my payout." I listened to the sound of his breathing, picturing his smug face. "You are not my son," I said, my voice completely flat, carrying the cold weight of absolute certainty. "The laboratory results just arrived. There is a 0% biological match between us. You are Thomas Barnes, the son of Gregory Barnes, my former driver. You used your father's knowledge of my family to orchestrate a massive financial extortion ring. The deal is entirely off. You are not getting another single cent from my accounts." I expected panic. I expected him to stutter, to deny the accusation, or to immediately threaten me with the police and the press. Instead, a low, genuinely amused chuckle drifted through the speaker. The laugh grew louder, echoing in the quiet hotel suite, entirely unbothered by the revelation of his true identity. "You really think you figured it all out, do you not, Richard?" Tommy laughed, the sound scraping against my ears. "You think you are the smartest guy in the room because you ran a little genetic test. But you are missing the entire point of the game." "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my grip tightening around the plastic casing of the phone. "I never said I was Leo." "Old man," Tommy replied, his tone shifting into a mocking, calculated drawl. "I never once claimed to be your missing golden boy. I just handed you a piece of paper and a photograph. I told you that I was the kid in the picture. That is exactly what I said. Nothing more and nothing less. You just jumped to your own emotional conclusions because you are desperate." I frowned, looking across the table at Victor, who simply shook his head slowly. The photograph. I remembered the faded image Tommy had pushed across the cafe table. It showed a small boy holding a bright red toy fire truck standing in front of a white brick building. It was an image that had haunted me for days because of its sheer familiarity. "Take another look at the picture," Richard Tommy taunted over the line. "Look really closely at the clothes. Tell me what you see. I will give you a hint. The truth is in the fabric." I ended the call abruptly, throwing the burner phone onto the table. I reached into my briefcase, tearing through the stacks of ledgers and legal documents, until I found the manila folder Tommy had given me. I pulled out the photograph, my hands shaking with a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, holding the image up to the bright morning light. I scrutinized the photograph, forcing myself to look past the overwhelming shock of the initial encounter. I studied the small boy. I looked at the shape of his jaw, the curve of his nose, the set of his dark eyes. It was not Leo. I had been so blinded by the sudden appearance of the toy fire truck and the emotional trauma of the moment that I had projected my own son's face onto the child. The boy in the photograph was undoubtedly a young Tommy Barnes. But then my eyes drifted down to the clothing the boy was wearing. My breath caught sharply in my throat, snagging on a detail that completely shattered the remaining fragments of my sanity. The child in the photograph was wearing a distinct bright red winter jacket with custom brass toggles and a very specific dark blue corduroy collar. I knew that jacket. I remembered buying that exact jacket at a boutique in London during a business trip. I had brought it home and presented it to Leo for his 4th birthday. It was a completely unique custom garment that could not be purchased in any normal store. Tommy was telling the horrible truth. It was his face in the photograph, but he was wearing my missing son's winter clothes. I stared at the red corduroy collar in the photograph, the unique brass toggles blurring as the sheer horror of the revelation washed over me. It was not a ransom photo. It was a trophy. Tommy Barnes was wearing the very clothes my son had on the day he vanished. The implications were too monstrous to fully comprehend in that small hotel room, but the path forward was suddenly crystal clear. I picked up the burner phone from the glass table and dialed the direct line to the head of my private security detail. These were not corporate guards. They were former military operatives I retained for high-level asset protection men who operated with absolute discretion and devastating efficiency. I gave my head of security a single precise directive. I gave him the license plate number of the black sports car Tommy had driven to the warehouse, along with his full legal name and his likely locations around the city. I told my team to find him, acquire him quietly, and bring him back to Pier 4 immediately. I did not care what methods they used. I only cared about results. Victor Thorne watched me from across the room, sensing the dangerous shift in my demeanor. I thanked Victor for the laboratory results and told him to continue the financial strangulation of my son. Then I left the hotel and drove back through the dark streets of Boston toward the industrial waterfront. The rain had started again, slicking the roads and matching the cold, relentless rhythm of my heart. I arrived at the warehouse and unlocked the heavy metal doors, stepping back into the vast, echoing space. I turned on the single overhead floodlight and waited. Less than 2 hours later, the sound of heavy tires grinding against the wet concrete signaled their arrival. A black tactical vehicle pulled directly into the center of the warehouse. The rear doors slid open, and 2 of my operatives stepped out, dragging a thrashing, furious Tommy Barnes between them. They had zip-tied his wrists behind his back. His designer leather jacket was torn at the shoulder, and his arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, wide-eyed panic of a cornered animal. They threw him roughly into a metal folding chair directly beneath the harsh glare of the floodlight. My men stepped back, melting into the shadows by the exits, ensuring there was absolutely no way out. I walked slowly into the light, my footsteps echoing against the concrete. Tommy struggled against his restraints, his chest heaving as he glared up at me. "Are you insane?" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking with fear and outrage. "You cannot just kidnap people off the street. I will call the police. I will have you locked up for the rest of your miserable life." I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I pulled a thick black dossier from my briefcase and dropped it heavily onto the rusted shipping crate in front of him. "You are not going to call anyone Thomas," I said, making sure he heard his real name. I watched the color instantly drain from his face as I said it. "Yes, I know exactly who you are. You are Gregory Barnes's son. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about Apex Holdings. I know about the $50,000 monthly transfers my son Bradley has been wiring you for the last decade. And I know that you are wearing my dead son's winter jacket in that photograph." Tommy stopped struggling. The bluster completely evaporated from his expression. I leaned down, resting my hands on the table, bringing my face inches from his. "Here is the reality of your situation," I continued, my voice a deadly whisper. "I have a team of former federal prosecutors and cyber specialists documenting every single wire fraud and extortion demand you have ever made. You have stolen millions of dollars across international borders. That is a federal crime that carries a mandatory minimum sentence that will ensure you die in a concrete cell. I am going to hand this entire dossier to the Federal Bureau of Investigation in exactly 5 minutes, unless you tell me exactly what your father did to my son." Tommy swallowed hard. The silence in the warehouse was deafening, broken only by the sound of the rain drumming against the tin roof. He looked at the dossier, then up at the cold, unyielding faces of my security team waiting in the shadows. He finally realized that the old man he thought he was playing had actually orchestrated his complete and total destruction. The realization broke him. "Please," Tommy gasped, his voice trembling violently. "Please, you have to understand. It was never my plan. It was my father. He set the whole thing up before he died. He left me the offshore accounts and the instructions on how to keep squeezing Bradley. He told me it was my inheritance. I reached out with a pocket knife and swiftly sliced the zip ties binding his wrists. "I do not care about your inheritance," I demanded, stepping back. "I want the truth." "What did Gregory do?" Tommy rubbed his raw wrists, his hands shaking as he reached into the inner pocket of his torn leather jacket. He pulled out a small, faded leather-bound book. He placed it carefully on the metal table, sliding it toward me. It was a handwritten journal. "That is my father's diary," Tommy whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the exits. "He documented everything. Every payout, every lie, every meeting. When he got sick last year, he gave it to me. He told me the Caldwell family owed us this money for what he did for them. He said it was hazard pay for taking their darkest secret to his grave." I stared at the worn leather cover of the journal. It looked like an ordinary, unremarkable notebook, but it pulsed with a heavy, sickening gravity. I reached out and let my fingers brush against the rough binding. "You need to read it," Tommy said, his voice dropping to a desperate, urgent tone. "Because you have it all wrong, Richard. You think my father was a kidnapper. You think he stole your boy and demanded a ransom. But that is absolutely not what actually happened." I slowly opened the cover of the journal. The pages were filled with Gregory's cramped, precise handwriting. I saw dates, times, and detailed accounts of private conversations involving my wife. My eyes scanned the ink, trying to process the terrible reality of the words before me. Tommy stood up slowly, taking a cautious step backward into the shadows. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and terror. "Your wife did not pay my dad a fake ransom 30 years ago," Tommy said, the words hanging in the damp, freezing air of the warehouse like a death sentence. "She did not drop that money in a dumpster to save her little boy from strangers. She paid my father to hide a dead body and stage a very elaborate kidnapping." I stared at Tommy Barnes, the air in the warehouse growing thick and suffocating. "Hide a body." The words echoed in the cold, cavernous space, slicing through my chest with the precision of a surgical scalpel. I looked down at the faded leather-bound journal resting on the rusted metal crate. My hands, which had remained perfectly steady while dismantling corporate empires, now trembled violently as I opened the cover. The pages were yellowed with age, filled with the neat, meticulous cursive of a man who had spent his entire life following strict schedules and logging mileage. I bypassed the mundane entries, my eyes searching frantically for the dates surrounding that cursed weekend in October 30 years ago. I found the page marked with a heavily underlined heading. It read, "The Lake House." I began to read, and with every sentence the entire foundation of my existence crumbled into dust. Gregory Barnes had not written a mere confession. He had authored a vivid, excruciatingly detailed autopsy of my marriage and the murder of my only son. 30 years ago, while I was navigating a complex, high-stakes corporate merger in London, Diane was not resting at the Beacon Hill estate as she had claimed. According to the meticulous notes left by my loyal chauffeur, Diane had engaged in a reckless, passionate affair with a local country club tennis instructor. She had packed up our 4-year-old son Leo and driven him to our remote, isolated summer cabin at the lake. It was a property nestled deep within the dense pine forests, miles away from prying eyes or inquisitive neighbors. The journal detailed the events of that Saturday afternoon with a sickening clarity. Diane had invited her lover to the cabin. While they occupied the master bedroom, my wife had left our 4-year-old child entirely unsupervised. To ensure she was not bothered, she had poured herself multiple generous glasses of vodka, a habit she had carefully hidden from me for years. The diary recorded how she simply let Leo wander out the back door down the sloping grassy lawn and straight toward the wooden dock that stretched out over the deep, freezing water of the lake. Gregory wrote that Diane had lost track of time. Hours had passed. When her lover finally departed, she stumbled out onto the back porch to look for the boy. She found him floating face down near the edge of the dock, his small body tangled in the thick, dark weeds. He had drowned. My beautiful, innocent 4-year-old son had drowned alone in the freezing water because his mother was too drunk and too occupied to care. A low, guttural sound escaped my throat. I squeezed my eyes shut, fighting off a sudden wave of blinding nausea. But the horror etched into the pages of the journal was far from over. Gregory detailed the frantic, hysterical phone call he received from Diane later that evening. She did not call an ambulance. She did not call the local police. She did not call me in London. She called her loyal driver. Diane was absolutely terrified. But she was not terrified of the loss of her child. She was utterly terrified of the consequences. She knew that if the police arrived and found her intoxicated with her lover's vehicle tracks in the driveway and her neglected son dead in the water, she would be charged with gross criminal negligence. She knew I would divorce her immediately, leaving her completely penniless, publicly disgraced, and stripped of the immense social standing she worshipped above all else. So she offered Gregory Barnes a devastating proposition. She offered him $250,000 in untraceable cash to fix her catastrophic mistake. Gregory accepted the blood money. He drove the company town car out to the secluded lake cabin under the cover of darkness. The diary contained a horrifying map, a crude hand-drawn sketch, showing a dense cluster of birch trees located precisely 3 miles north of the property line. Gregory described how he took a shovel from the maintenance shed, dug a shallow grave in the damp earth, and buried my son in the cold, dark woods. He buried him like a piece of discarded garbage, while my wife watched from the warmth of the cabin porch, a fresh glass of liquor in her trembling hand. She watched a man bury her own child without shedding a single genuine tear for his passing. I gripped the edge of the metal table, gasping for air. The warehouse walls seemed to be closing in on me. I looked up at Tommy, who stood perfectly still in the shadows, watching me absorb the poison his father had left behind. "Read the rest," Tommy whispered, his voice devoid of his previous arrogance. "Read how they pulled it off. You need to know exactly how your loving wife played you for a fool all these decades." I forced my eyes back down to the yellowed pages. Gregory explained the mechanics of the illusion. A drowned child and a missing child required entirely different investigations. A drowning would lead the police directly to the lake house and expose Diane's negligence. A kidnapping, however, would turn her into a tragic, sympathetic victim. The next morning, Gregory drove Diane back to Boston. He brought his own son Tommy along for the ride. Tommy was almost exactly the same age and build as Leo. Gregory took the bright red winter jacket with the distinct blue corduroy collar, the jacket I had brought back from London, and placed it onto Tommy's shoulders. He pulled the hood up to obscure the boy's face. They drove to the crowded Chestnut Hill shopping mall to enact their plan. Gregory instructed his young son to run through the dense crowds, keeping his head down and moving quickly toward the rear exit. Meanwhile, Diane positioned herself near the central fountain. The moment Tommy darted past the jewelry kiosks, a flash of bright red fabric moving swiftly through the sea of shoppers, Diane unleashed a piercing, theatrical scream. She pointed frantically at the retreating figure, screaming that someone had just snatched her child. The mall erupted into total chaos. Security guards rushed to lock down the perimeter. Patrons panicked, and the police were dispatched by the dozens. In the confusion, Gregory quietly scooped up his own son at the rear exit, removed the red jacket, and drove away undetected. Diane collapsed onto the marble floor of the mall, sobbing uncontrollably, playing the role of the devastated, broken mother to absolute perfection. She birthed a lie so profound and so meticulously executed that it consumed my entire life. I closed the journal, my hands numb and freezing. The grand, tragic narrative of our family kidnapping was a vile performance. She had murdered my son with her neglect and buried him with her greed. And now her surviving son was using this very secret to steal everything I had built. Bradley knew the truth, and he had chosen extortion over justice. I placed the diary into my pocket. The time for sorrow was entirely gone. It was finally time for absolute retribution. The damp air of the warehouse suddenly felt suffocating, pressing down on my lungs like a physical weight. A wave of profound, violent nausea washed over me, twisting my stomach into tight, agonizing knots. I stumbled backward, my legs suddenly unable to support the massive gravity of the revelation. I hit the rusted edge of a shipping crate and collapsed onto it, clutching my chest with both hands. My heart was hammering a frantic, erratic rhythm against my ribs, struggling to pump blood through veins that felt filled with ice. I closed my eyes, but the darkness only offered a terrifying canvas for the horrifying images conjured by the diary. For 30 agonizing years, I had mourned a ghost. I had spent countless sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, visualizing the face of the monster who had snatched my beautiful, innocent boy from a crowded shopping mall. I had funded massive private investigations, offered multi-million-dollar rewards, and chased down every phantom lead across the globe. I had held my weeping wife in my arms, sharing a profound, fabricated grief, entirely unaware that the monster I was hunting was the very woman weeping against my shoulder. Diane had watched me slowly die inside day after day, decade after decade, while she secretly paid for the silent burial of our son in a shallow, unmarked grave in the cold woods. I forced my eyes open, staring down at the yellowed pages of the journal resting on the table. The urge to rip the book to shreds was overwhelming, but the agonizing truth demanded to be read in its entirety. I steadied my trembling hands, wiping the cold sweat from my forehead, and slowly turned the page. I expected to find more details of Gregory Barnes and his disgusting complicity, but the handwriting shifted. The dates jumped forward by 2 decades. The ink was fresher, the entries more recent. Gregory had documented a completely new chapter of extortion, a dark twist that plunged the knife even deeper into my shattered soul. Exactly 10 years ago, when my son Bradley was 28 years old, he had been snooping through Gregory's private quarters above the carriage house. Gregory had suffered a mild heart attack and was resting in the hospital. Bradley, always the entitled, arrogant prince, had been looking for a set of missing keys to a vintage sports car. Instead, he found the hidden lockbox containing the chauffeur's meticulous journal. Bradley had read the same horrifying pages I had just read. He had discovered the brutal, unforgivable truth about his little brother's death and his mother's monstrous cover-up. As a father, I wanted to believe that reading such an atrocity would have broken Bradley. I desperately wanted to believe that my eldest son had marched straight into the house, confronted his mother with righteous fury, and dragged her to the nearest police station to finally bring justice to Leo. But as my eyes scanned Gregory's frantic, terrified handwriting, the final devastating illusion of my family was completely obliterated. Bradley did not seek justice. He did not shed a single tear for the little brother he had supposedly mourned. Bradley realized he had just stumbled upon the ultimate golden ticket. The journal detailed the exact afternoon Bradley confronted Gregory. He did not threaten the old man with prison. He simply smiled, holding the diary in his hands, and offered a renegotiation of terms. Bradley then walked directly into his mother's private sitting room. He threw the diary onto her lap and watched the color drain from her face. He watched the woman who gave him life crumble into a pathetic, sobbing mess. But Bradley felt no pity. He saw an extraordinary leverage. He told Diane that he would keep her horrific secret buried forever, and he would personally ensure that Gregory Barnes was paid handsomely to remain silent until the end of his days. But his silence came with an astronomical price. At that time, Diane held 30% of the voting shares in Caldwell Logistics, a massive block of power that I had gifted to her early in our marriage. Bradley demanded that she immediately and quietly transfer total control of those voting rights directly to him. He wanted unquestioned authority within the boardroom. He wanted the power to slowly, systematically sideline me and eventually seize the chief executive chair without any resistance. Diane, absolutely paralyzed by the terrifying prospect of losing her lavish lifestyle and facing a murder charge, signed the documents without a single moment of hesitation. She traded her dead son's justice to save her own skin, and she handed my empire over to a sociopath. Gregory wrote about how Bradley proudly took over the extortion payments. But my son was far too greedy to use his own personal wealth. Instead, he set up the elaborate network of offshore accounts, funneling the hush money directly out of my corporate discretionary funds under the guise of Apex Holdings. He was using my own money to pay the man who buried my murdered child. When Gregory died, Bradley seamlessly transferred the arrangement to Tommy, ensuring the dark secret remained securely locked away while he continued to consolidate his stolen power. Bradley had traded his dead little brother's justice for the chief executive chair. I sat in the dim, freezing warehouse, the silence pressing against my eardrums. The agonizing pain that had gripped my chest slowly began to evaporate, replaced by a sensation that was entirely foreign to me. The crushing sadness, the heavy, suffocating grief that had defined my existence for 3 decades simply vanished. It was burned away by a white-hot, all-consuming fire. The realization that my entire family was a den of vipers, that the people sharing my home and my name were ruthless monsters, stripped away the last remaining shreds of my humanity. I was no longer a grieving father. I was no longer a betrayed husband. I had become a machine of pure, unadulterated vengeance. I carefully closed the faded leather journal, feeling the rough texture of the cover against my fingertips. I slid the book securely into the inner pocket of my tailored suit jacket, pressing it flat against my chest. I looked down at Tommy Barnes, who was still cowering in the folding chair, watching me with wide, terrified eyes. My security operatives remained perfectly still in the shadows, waiting for my command. I did not say a single word to the pathetic grifter. His fate was already sealed, and he was no longer relevant to the grand design of my retribution. I pulled my secure mobile phone from my pocket and dialed a highly encrypted number. The line connected immediately, the secure connection humming softly in the quiet space. "Victor," I stated, my voice echoing through the vast, empty warehouse with a terrifying mechanical calmness. "I have the entire truth. The ransom was a lie. Diane killed him. Gregory buried him, and Bradley has been running the cover-up for a decade to steal my company." There was a brief, heavy silence on the other end of the line, as Victor Thorne, a man who had seen the absolute worst of human nature, processed the sheer magnitude of the evil. "What are your orders, Richard?" Victor finally asked, his tone shifting into the cold, precise cadence of a prosecutor preparing to dismantle a criminal empire. I walked slowly toward the heavy metal doors, my footsteps echoing loudly, like the steady ticking of a metronome counting down to their utter destruction. I stepped out into the cold, pouring rain, letting the freezing water wash over my face, feeling nothing but the absolute certainty of my impending wrath. "It is time for the slaughter," I replied smoothly, and ended the phone call. I pocketed the secure phone and signaled my detail to secure the warehouse. The rain fell as my driver navigated the car back toward the airfield. I boarded my jet in silence, instructing the pilot to return us to Boston. The illusion of my medical retreat needed to be maintained perfectly. During the flight, I practiced the mechanics of a dying man. I let my shoulders hunch, practiced the shallow breathing of a failing heart, and allowed exhaustion to settle into my face. By the time the car pulled through the gates, I looked like a man with a foot inside the grave. The heavy oak door swung open. I dragged my feet across the marble foyer, clutching my chest with a trembling hand. Diane was waiting at the bottom of the grand staircase, playing the terrified, devoted wife with sickening perfection. She rushed forward, wrapping her arms around me, her face buried against my shoulder. "Oh, Richard," she murmured, her voice laced with manufactured anxiety. "You look so pale. You should not have traveled back so soon. The doctor said you needed complete isolation." I offered her a weak smile, letting my hand rest gently against her arm. "I feel much better, Diane." I lied smoothly, letting my voice crack. The ocean air cleared my mind. I realized I cannot hide from the inevitable. The company needs strong leadership. Bradley came down the stairs, followed closely by Valerie. He looked at me with an expression of thinly veiled triumph. "Dad," Bradley said, placing a patronizing hand on my shoulder. "You look like you need a hospital bed, not a boardroom." I nodded slowly, leaning heavily against the banister. "You are right, son," I whispered, projecting total defeat. "That is exactly why I came back early. I made my final decision. I am stepping down. Effective tomorrow morning, you are officially the Chief Executive Officer." The flash of pure, unadulterated greed that illuminated Bradley's face was almost blinding to witness. Valerie squeezed his arm tightly, her eyes wide with victorious, undisguised excitement. To properly celebrate this momentous occasion, I continued, my voice barely above a raspy, painful whisper. "I want us to have a formal family dinner tonight. In the grand dining room. Just the four of us. We absolutely need to honor this transition properly and beautifully." Diane immediately fluttered into action, eagerly ordering the household staff to prepare a lavish feast, completely blind to the cold executioner standing patiently in her grand hallway. 3 hours later, the grand dining room was a perfect portrait of opulent deception. The massive mahogany table was meticulously set with our finest crystal and glowing candelabras. I sat silently at the head of the table, observing the terrible monsters feasting happily in my home. Valerie sat to my right, wearing a stunning black evening gown. Around her delicate neck rested a spectacular necklace of flawless diamonds. I recognized the expensive stones immediately. They were purchased last month using corporate discretionary funds that Bradley had authorized under the false guise of a fake foreign vendor acquisition. She touched the diamonds constantly proudly, flaunting the wealth she believed she had successfully stolen. Diane sat to my left, the absolute picture of maternal grace. She sliced my roasted tenderloin into small pieces, acting as if I lacked the physical strength to simply feed myself. "Eat slowly." Richard, she cooed gently, pouring a measure of red wine into my crystal glass. You need to quickly regain your strength for your upcoming retirement. I stared intensely at the hands carefully pouring the wine. Those were the exact hands that had paid a chauffeur $250,000 to bury my murdered 4-year-old son in a cold, unmarked grave. It took every ounce of physical discipline I possessed not to wrap my fingers tightly around her throat right there. True vengeance requires absolute, unyielding patience. I took a small, slow sip of the wine. As the dessert plates were efficiently cleared by the silent staff, Bradley stood up proudly from his chair at the opposite end of the long table. He raised his heavy glass of vintage champagne, tapping the fragile crystal lightly with a polished silver spoon. The clear, ringing sound echoed loudly through the high ceilings of the room. Diane and Valerie turned their full attention to him, their faces glowing with sheer adoration and impending wealth. I want to make a special toast, Bradley began, his voice booming with the arrogant authority he believed he had finally earned today. To my father, Richard. For 40 incredible, demanding years, you built a massive empire from the ground up. You sacrificed your precious health and your endless energy to provide this incredible, luxurious life for us. Your immense sacrifices will absolutely never be forgotten by any one of us. Bradley stepped out gracefully from behind his tall chair, walking slowly down the length of the polished table, fully commanding the silent room. He looked at me directly, with an expression of profound, sickening hypocrisy. Taking the demanding reins of Caldwell Logistics is the greatest honor of my entire life, he proudly declared, raising his glass even higher. I promise you, Dad, that I will fiercely protect our family name. I will protect our vast assets. I will forever honor the incredible, lasting legacy you have built, and I will ensure that this family remains powerful for generations to come. To family and to our great legacy. Valerie and Diane both enthusiastically raised their glasses in unison. To our family and legacy, they chimed perfectly together. They drank their expensive champagne, smiling warmly at one another. I did not raise my glass. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat against the polished mahogany table. The illusion of the frail, dying patriarch instantly vanished. I straightened my spine, pulling my broad shoulders back. The labored breathing stopped, replaced by a deep, steady rhythm. The change in my physical posture was so sudden and profound that the happy smiles faltered on their faces. The temperature in the room plummeted. Bradley lowered his glass, his brow furrowing in confusion as he looked at me. Dad, he asked, his arrogant tone wavering slightly. Is something very wrong? I stood up slowly from my chair, rising to my full height. I looked at Diane, whose hand had suddenly begun to tremble, the wine rippling in her glass. I looked at Valerie, whose fingers nervously clutched the stolen diamonds at her throat. Finally, I locked my gaze entirely on Bradley. He took a small step backward, sensing the lethal danger radiating from my absolute stillness. I picked up my crystal glass of red wine and held it suspended in the air. I offered them a cold, terrifying smile that did not reach my eyes. That was a truly beautiful speech, Bradley. I said, my voice echoing with a smooth, dark resonance that shattered the quiet room. You spoke so eloquently about family, about sacrifice, and about protecting our name. It is truly remarkable how effortlessly you can lie while drinking my expensive champagne. I watched the blood drain from his face. Speaking of legacy, I continued, reaching slowly into the inner pocket of my tailored jacket. I brought a very special gift for tonight. It is a wonderful bedtime story from 1996. I pulled the faded journal from my pocket and slammed it down onto the center of the dining table. It hit the polished wood with a heavy thud that sounded like a judge's gavel striking the block. I slid the chauffeur's diary directly across the table, watching it come to a complete stop right in front of Diane's trembling hands. Let's talk about what really happened at the lake, my dear. Diane stared at the small, battered book. Complete recognition dawned on her face, followed instantly by unadulterated terror. The delicate crystal wine glass slipped from her numb fingers, shattering against the china plate and splashing dark red liquid across the pristine white tablecloth like fresh blood. A guttural primal scream tore from her throat. It was the visceral shriek of a woman watching her fabricated existence open beneath her feet. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor, her hands clawing desperately at her evening gown, gasping for air as if the room had suddenly been plunged underwater. Bradley did not hesitate. His survival instinct immediately overrode his initial shock. He realized instantly that the diary could destroy his empire and guarantee his imprisonment. With a feral, desperate growl, he violently shoved his heavy dining chair backward and lunged across the wide table. He ignored the crashing silverware, his hands reaching out to snatch the leather-bound journal before I could secure it. He never made it past the centerpiece. From the deep shadows of the adjoining hallway, the oak doors swung fully open. 4 men clad in black tactical suits stepped into the dining room. These were the elite security operatives I had summoned from the warehouse, moving with terrifying silence and absolute precision. Before Bradley's hands could brush the edge of the diary, 2 operatives moved in. They grabbed him by the shoulders, yanking him backward with bone-jarring force. They slammed him violently against the wallpapered wall, pinning his arms behind his back with effortless, brutal efficiency. The loud thud of his body hitting the plaster echoed sharply over his mother's hysterical weeping. Valerie jumped up from her chair, her face pale with sheer panic, her hands clutching the stolen diamonds around her neck. "Richard, what is this madness?" she yelled, her voice trembling with genuine fear as she looked at her husband pinned against the wall. "What are you doing to him?" I did not look at her. My gaze remained fixed on Bradley, who was struggling helplessly against the iron grip of my security team. "I am not losing my mind. Valerie." I stated, my voice echoing with a calm, lethal resonance. "For the first time in 30 years, I have finally found it." I reached into my pocket and slowly pulled out my secure mobile phone. I tapped the screen once, bringing up the digital audio file my cyber specialists had captured just hours prior. I pressed play and set the phone down next to the diary on the table. The crystal-clear audio recording of Bradley and Diane's secret conversation filled the grand dining room. Diane's panicked, weeping voice echoed from the small speaker. "If Richard finds out what really happened that day at the lake, he will kill me." Then Bradley's cold, menacing response cut through the air. "He won't, because you are going to keep your mouth shut, or I will stop paying Tommy, and you will spend your final years locked in a federal penitentiary." The recording finished, plunging the room into a suffocating, heavy silence, broken only by Diane's ragged breathing. Valerie stared at her husband in absolute horrified disbelief, slowly backing away from the table. I walked slowly around the mahogany table, stopping directly in front of Bradley. "You traded your dead little brother's justice for a corner office and a false sense of power," I said, my voice carrying the destructive force of a hurricane. "I know everything, Bradley. I know about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. I know about Apex Holdings. I know about the $50,000 monthly transfers you authorized to keep Thomas Barnes quiet. I know exactly how you systematically drained my corporate funds to finance your extortion ring, while smiling in my face and claiming to protect our legacy." Bradley strained against the guards, a desperate sweat breaking out across his forehead. "Dad, listen to me," he pleaded, his arrogant facade finally cracking under the immense weight of the undeniable truth. I interrupted, stepping closer, my eyes boring directly into his terrified soul. "I know that your mother drove my 4-year-old son to the lake cabin 30 years ago to meet a lover. I know she got drunk and let him drown alone in the freezing water. I know she paid Gregory Barnes $250,000 to bury his tiny body like discarded trash to save her miserable social standing." I leaned in, dropping my voice to a razor-sharp hiss. "And thanks to Gregory's meticulous record-keeping, I also know the precise GPS coordinates of the birch grove where my son's bones have been buried in the cold earth for 3 decades. The Federal Bureau of Investigation is securing that exact perimeter right now." Diane let out an agonizing shriek, curling into a trembling ball on the floor. Bradley's eyes widened in sheer panic. The realization that I involved federal authorities hit him like a physical blow. His chest heaved as he searched for a way out of the inescapable corner he had painted himself into. He resorted to the only language he truly understood. "Dad." "Wait, please, wait," Bradley begged, his voice shifting into the rapid cadence of negotiation. "We can fix this. We can keep this quiet. Think about the empire. Think about the market share. If this scandal gets out, if the press gets hold of a murder cover-up and federal embezzlement, the company stock will tank immediately. It will be an absolute massacre on the trading floor. You will lose hundreds of millions of dollars overnight. Your entire legacy will be completely destroyed. I can help you manage the fallout. Just keep the feds out of it." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperation wash over me. He genuinely believed the threat of losing corporate wealth would somehow deter me. He believed I cared about profit margins more than the memory of my murdered child. The last remaining trace of paternal connection evaporated, leaving only a cold satisfaction. I offered him a slow, chilling smile. It was a smile devoid of warmth, a predator staring down its broken prey. "You vastly underestimate me, Bradley," I replied softly, my tone carrying the absolute finality of an executioner swinging the blade. "I do not care about Caldwell Logistics anymore. I do not care about the stock prices, the market share, or the board of directors." I reached back into my pocket and pulled out a single folded sheet of thick legal paper. "I already sold my entire block of controlling shares to a rival private equity firm exactly 48 hours ago," I stated, watching the final sliver of hope vanish from his widening eyes. "The deal is legally finalized, and the funds have been successfully cleared into an irrevocable blind trust. When the market opens on Monday morning, the news of your arrest will absolutely decimate the remaining stock value, leaving you and the board with nothing but worthless paper and catastrophic debt. I systematically liquidated my empire to ensure you have absolutely nothing left to steal. I do not care about the company anymore, son. I only care about destroying you." Diane stared at the diary as if it were a venomous snake upon the table. The magnificent illusion she had maintained for 30 years shattered into irreparable pieces. She tried to speak, producing only a pathetic gasp. She scrambled backward on the floor, her expensive gown tangling around her legs. Bradley remained pinned against the wall by my security operatives, his face a mask of absolute terror. He finally comprehended the magnitude of his miscalculation. He had believed he was the apex predator here. He had completely forgotten who built the jungle. In the heavy silence, a new sound emerged from the distance. It started as a faint wail echoing through the wet streets of Beacon Hill. Within seconds, the sound multiplied, growing louder and more urgent. The police sirens transformed into a deafening roar as a massive convoy of law enforcement vehicles converged on the estate. Flashing red and blue lights illuminated the rain-slicked windows, casting frantic shadows across the walls. Bradley squeezed his eyes shut. Diane pressed her hands over her ears, curling into a ball on the floor, whimpering as the reality of imprisonment crashed down upon her. The heavy oak front doors did not just open. They were thrown open with a thunderous crash that echoed through the foyer. Tactical boots stomped across the marble floors. My security operatives stepped back, melting into the shadows. Victor Thorne walked into the dining room first. My attorney looked sharp in his dark suit, his face devoid of emotion. He carried a thick leather briefcase, a harbinger of ruin. Behind Victor came a formidable wall of federal agents in dark windbreakers, accompanied by local homicide detectives, conveying a grim determination. The room filled with crackling police radios and the metallic clinking of handcuffs. Victor stepped forward, stopping near the shattered wine glass. "Richard Victor," said, his voice calm. "The perimeter is fully secured. The federal warrants have been executed, and the forensic excavation team has arrived at the coordinates in the woods. They will find the boy tonight." I nodded, my face an unreadable mask of stone. I looked at my wife, the woman who traded our son for social standing. A homicide detective stepped around the table, pulling Diane roughly to her feet. She was sobbing hysterically, her makeup running down her pale face, her gown ruined. Diane Caldwell, the detective announced with unquestionable authority. You are under arrest for the involuntary manslaughter of Leo Caldwell. You are charged with severe obstruction of justice, filing a false police report, and concealment of a human corpse. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. Diane tried to pull away, begging for help, but the detective snapped the steel handcuffs around her wrists. The metallic click echoed loudly, symbolizing the end of her reign of deception. Across the room, 2 federal agents approached Bradley. He did not fight them. The greedy prince of Caldwell Logistics was completely broken. His shoulders slumped in defeat as they pulled his arms behind his back. Bradley Caldwell, the federal agent, stated, reading from a document. You are under arrest for massive corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand extortion. Furthermore, you are charged as an accessory after the fact to a homicide. The penalty for these combined offenses carries a mandatory minimum sentence guaranteeing you will spend the rest of your life in a penitentiary. Bradley looked at me as the agents locked the handcuffs onto his wrists. His eyes pleaded for a mercy he did not deserve. He opened his mouth to offer another negotiation, but the handcuffs silenced him completely. Valerie stood frozen near the edge of the table, watching the horrific scene unfold. Her perfect, luxurious life was disintegrating right before her eyes. The stolen diamonds around her neck suddenly looked like a suffocating chain. As the agents prepared to march her husband out, Valerie finally broke. She let out a loud wail, tears streaming down her contoured face. She rushed toward me, her hands clasped together in a desperate, frantic plea. Richard! What is this madness? Valerie yelled, her voice cracking with panic. What are you doing? What is going to happen to us? What am I supposed to do now? Where am I supposed to go? You cannot just leave me with nothing. I looked at her, feeling absolutely nothing but profound, chilling disgust. This woman had happily spent the money extracted from my dead son's grave. She had reveled in the stolen wealth without ever questioning its dark origins. I turned my body slightly, addressing her, with a voice so incredibly cold it seemed to freeze the very air in the room. You have exactly 10 minutes to pack your fake designer bags and leave this property permanently, I told her, measuring every single syllable for maximum impact. Do not attempt to take anything of real value. The security staff will monitor your departure. Every single credit card in your name has already been canceled. The bank accounts are frozen and the luxury vehicles have been impounded. Valerie gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as her knees buckled slightly. But I have no money, she sobbed pathetically. I have absolutely nowhere to go. I looked her directly in the eyes, my expression utterly devoid of any sympathy or forgiveness. Welcome to the real world, Valerie, I replied smoothly. I suggest you walk quickly. The storm outside is getting worse. I turned my back on her weeping form and walked slowly toward the large bay windows overlooking the grand circular driveway. The heavy rain continued to fall in relentless sheets, washing the pristine concrete. I stood perfectly still, a silent sentinel in my empty, luxurious home. I watched through the rain-streaked glass as the federal agents escorted Diane and Bradley out of the front doors. They marched them roughly down the wide stone steps, pushing them into the back of the waiting police cruisers. The harsh red and blue lights illuminated their pale, defeated faces one final time before the heavy car doors slammed shut, sealing their fate forever. The convoy of law enforcement vehicles slowly pulled away, their sirens blaring into the dark, stormy night, carrying away the monsters who had stolen my life. The house grew incredibly quiet, the silence wrapping around me like a protective cloak. I remained standing by the window, my hands resting at my sides. For 30 years, I had carried an agonizing, suffocating burden of unresolved grief and lingering guilt. Now that immense weight was gone. I looked out into the stormy darkness, feeling a deep, abiding sense of peace finally settling into my battered soul. The empire I had built was entirely gone sold for parts and scattered to the wind. My marriage was revealed as a grotesque, bloody lie. My remaining son was a convicted traitor heading to a concrete cell. But as I watched the taillights of the police cruisers disappear into the Boston night, I knew none of those profound losses mattered anymore. Justice had finally arrived for my little boy. The slate was wiped clean. The terrible nightmare was finally over. 6 months passed since that stormy night. The subsequent legal proceedings were swift, highly publicized, and devoid of mercy. The media descended upon Boston, hungry for every sordid detail of the Caldwell family's spectacular collapse. I did not hide from the flashing cameras or the relentless reporters camped outside the courthouse steps. I stood tall in the crowded, echoing courtrooms, watching with absolute detachment as the intricate, bloody tapestry of my wife's and son's deceptions was laid bare for the world to witness. Diane's trial lasted less than 2 weeks. Faced with the insurmountable evidence of Gregory Barnes's detailed journal and the damning audio recordings, her defense attorneys quickly advised her to accept a plea agreement. She stood before the imposing federal judge, a pale, trembling shadow of the formidable socialite she had once been. She wept openly as she confessed to the involuntary manslaughter of our 4-year-old son. She admitted to the severe obstruction of justice, the filing of false police reports, and the unthinkable concealment of a human corpse. The judge showed zero leniency. She was sentenced to 25 years in a maximum security penitentiary, a concrete cell where her social status meant nothing. Bradley fought his charges with the desperate ferocity of a cornered animal. But his vast corporate empire had already been dismantled by the private equity firm. Without my fortune to shield him from the consequences of his arrogance, his legal team abandoned him. He was easily convicted of massive corporate embezzlement, grand extortion, wire fraud, and acting as an accessory after the fact to a violent homicide. He stood in his tailored suit, his jaw clenched in furious disbelief as the judge handed down a mandatory minimum sentence of 40 years without the possibility of parole. They were stripped of their stolen wealth, hollow titles, and undeserved freedom. I never visited them in prison. I never answered their begging letters. They ceased to exist in my reality. The only event that truly mattered during those agonizing 6 months of legal battles was the final recovery of my little boy. The specialized federal excavation team, guided by the precise GPS coordinates detailed in the chauffeur's diary, located the shallow grave in the dense birch grove, exactly 3 miles north of the isolated lake cabin. The forensic anthropologists worked meticulously for 3 days, treating the damp, freezing earth with the profound reverence that Diane had denied him. When the lead detective finally called my secure line to confirm they had successfully recovered Leo's remains, I did not break down. Instead, a profound, quiet solemnity settled over my weary spirit. We brought him back to Boston in a small, beautifully crafted mahogany casket. I organized a private, deeply peaceful burial on a quiet, rolling green hill overlooking the vast expanse of the churning Atlantic Ocean. There were no performative crowds, no superficial socialites, and no theatrical tears. It was just me, a few fiercely loyal members of my personal security detail, and the rhythmic sound of the ocean waves crashing against the distant rocky shoreline. The sky was a brilliant cloudless blue. I ordered a simple, elegant white marble headstone to mark his final resting place. It bore his name, his actual dates of birth and passing, and a single inscription engraved in gold lettering that read, "Finally found, forever loved." Today, the crisp autumn wind carries a sharp, biting chill as I stand entirely alone by Leo's quiet grave. The brittle golden leaves fall softly from the towering oak trees, blanketing the manicured grass in a vibrant mosaic of amber and deep crimson. I reach out slowly, my leather-gloved fingers gently brushing the cold, smooth surface of the pristine marble headstone. I am an old, tired man now, standing quietly in the fading twilight of my life, without a deceitful wife, without a treacherous son, and without the massive corporate empire that defined my entire adult existence. By all conventional societal metrics, I have lost absolutely everything a man could possess. Yet, as I stand here breathing in the crisp ocean air, I realize a profound truth. For the very first time in 30 long, agonizing years, the crushing, suffocating physical weight has completely vanished from my chest. The agonizing phantom pain of the unknown, the endless, torturous nights spent wondering if my little boy was cold, hungry, or calling out for his father in the dark, have all been permanently silenced. The grand, bloody illusion of my family has been rightfully reduced to a pile of smoldering ashes. But in its empty place, I possess the one singular thing that my limitless money could never truly buy. I finally have the complete, undeniable truth. And the truth, no matter how brutal, how bloody, or how devastating it may be, brings a profound, unshakable peace. I am completely alone in this world, but I am no longer wandering blindly in the dark. With the Caldwell Logistics empire sold to the private equity firm, I found myself sitting on a remaining personal liquid fortune of exactly $100 million. It was a staggering, incomprehensible amount of accumulated wealth. However, that paper money had lost all of its intrinsic value to my soul. It could not magically rewrite the tragic past, and it could not bring my innocent son back from the freezing, suffocating waters of the remote lake. But as I spent my quiet, solitary evenings looking out over the twinkling lights of the Boston harbor, I realized exactly what that immense wealth could do for other desperate people. I established the Leo Caldwell Foundation. I bypassed the slow-moving bureaucratic charitable routes and focused entirely on immediate aggressive boots-on-the-ground action. I used the entirety of the $100 million personal endowment to fully fund, equip, train, and deploy elite private investigation teams across the entire country. These are highly specialized units, comprised entirely of former federal agents, brilliant cybersecurity experts, and seasoned tactical military operatives. Their singular, relentless mission is to provide world-class, uncompromising investigative services completely free of charge to low-income families who are searching for their missing children. We hunt for children of families who cannot afford private detectives. We search for the vulnerable families who are ignored by underfunded, overworked local police departments. We fight for the heartbroken parents who are forced to live in the exact same agonizing, terrifying nightmare I personally endured for 3 long, dark decades. In the past 4 months, my operatives have safely recovered 16 missing children, returning them directly into the loving arms of their desperate parents. Every time my phone rings with a successful recovery report, I walk to my window and look out at the vast ocean. I think about the boy in the red jacket who never got to grow up. I think about the terrible secrets that festered in the shadows of my own home. I could not save my son from the monsters hiding in plain sight. But through this crusade, I am saving the sons and daughters of others. I took the darkest pain a human heart can experience and forged it into a beacon of ultimate salvation. The greatest tragedy in life is not being deceived by strangers, but discovering that the monsters you fear are the very people sleeping under your roof. We often blind ourselves to the flaws of our loved ones, believing that blood and marriage guarantee loyalty. But true loyalty is defined by actions, not titles. Money can buy silence, but it can never buy peace. When you finally stop making excuses for toxic family members and demand the truth, it will hurt. But that pain is the necessary price you must pay to reclaim your life, your dignity, and your absolute freedom. If this story opened your eyes to the harsh realities of family betrayal, hit the like button and subscribe right now. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had to cut ties with a toxic relative? Let me know where you're watching from. See you next time.